When Linda bought her first home in 1975, she was just 26 years old, fresh out of college and working as a teacher. Now, her salary was modest, yes, but the house, it cost $25,000. Now, that was a stretch for her even back then, but it was manageable. Fast forward to her grandson, Alex, who's also 26 today, working full time, juggling side gigs, and still living with roommates. He wants to buy a house, but the average home in his city cost over $400,000. And for Alex, home ownership doesn't feel just distant, it feels absolutely impossible. And folks, I know that many of you right now are thinking about personal choices here, but what if I told you that stories like Linda's and Alex's aren't about personal choices? They're about the invisible wall of time. Now, that's an invisible wall that separates generations. And you got on one side a housing boom and affordable education, and on the other, crushing student loans, stagnant wages, and skyrocketing rents. And speaking of this, today's episode is very unique because we are breaking down that wall by taking a perspective, a look at both sides. From boomers to zoomers, let's unpack the truth about the generational wealth gap, and more importantly, let's explore how we can bridge it together. And I have to say this before we dive in. This content on this episode is for educational and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as financial advice. Please do your own research. Now, also, we are talking about generations here, and I'd love to hear from you. What generation are you in, and what's your biggest financial challenge right now? Drop it in the comments. And if you're listening to this podcast, audio version, you can find my contact information in the show notes because your story might be the one someone else needs to hear. In order for us to really understand generational wealth disparities, because that's what we're talking about, and this invisible wall, you need to know it didn't appear overnight. It was built brick by brick through policies, economics, and timing. And depending on which side of that wall you were born, your financial path looks radically different. So let's take Richard, for example. He was born in 1948. He came of age when college tuition was affordable, even at top public universities. And he tells me that he worked part time at a diner, and that was enough to cover not only his rent, but also his tuition at a state college. Okay, let me say that again. Listen, he was working part time at a diner and he could pay his rent and pay his tuition. He didn't have any crushing student loans. He didn't have decades of long repayment plans. And by the time he graduated, he was debt free, and ready to start saving. So at 27, you know what Richard did? He bought a 3-bedroom home and it cost him $22,000. Now, that house is now worth over $400,000. That's the magic of compounding wealth through home equity, and it was available to a whole generation at the time. Now let's look at the boomer generation, roughly those born between 1946 and 1964. And there's a belief that they benefited from a unique economic window. In fact, there's lots of data that support this. There was affordable housing, expanding industries, pensions, and relatively inexpensive health care, which is a biggie, right? Many of them were able to build financial security not because they were better savers per se, but because they also had a system. I think they were good savers too. We don't want to act as if saving money doesn't help, but also the system was tilted in their favor. So if you're a boomer, I'd love to know, what was your first home or your first tuition bill? Just drop a comment or find the way to contact me if you're listening to this via audio, Because when we line up the numbers side by side, it's really eye opening for younger generations to see just how different the landscape was. Obviously, we have to temper that with what the wages were at the time as well. Now, let's jump forward and let's meet Jasmine. Jasmine was born in 1990, and we're going to talk about what a lot of millennials feel like, which is a millennial squeeze, running uphill on a downward escalator. And Jasmine is a perfect example. She did what everyone told her to do at the time, which was go to college, work hard, and you'll succeed. Except by the time she graduated in 2012, she was starting at $45,000 in student loans and walking into one of the worst job markets since the Great Depression. Well, that may change, but you know what her first job was? A part time retail gig, nowhere near enough to cover her rent and loan payments. Now, think back to Richard, who was working in a diner part time and covering rent and his tuition. Now, Jasmine is 34 and she's still paying off those loans, those student loans. Meanwhile, while she's doing that, the price of homes in her city has more than doubled since she graduated. And she says that she feels like every time she gets close to stable ground, the ground just keeps moving again. For context, millennials are those born between 1981 and 1996, and they carry the weight of 1.7 trillion in student debt. Wages adjusted for inflation are about 20% lower than boomers at the same age. So even though boomers, if you look at their wages and you think, wow, that's a really, really low wage, you have to adjust it for, I'll just call this cost of living. And the 2008 financial crisis didn't just stall their careers. Now we're talking about millennials here. It stole critical years of wealth building. So we have to remember that as well. So if you're a millennial and you're listening to this, do you feel like you lost a decade of your life just trying to recover? Share your story because so many people, I promise you, feel the same exact way. Now let's bring in Gen Z. Gen Z has an interesting dilemma, the digital dilemma, I'll call it, opportunity meeting instability. Because, and let's just use Diego as an example, because I ran across Diego's story. He was born in 2002 and he's what, in his 20s now, working as a video editor while also building a side hustle online. And on good months, he earns more than his parents did at his age. Makes sense. On bad months, guess what? He can't even cover his rent, or barely covers it. And what he said was, it feels like he has two choices: burn himself out chasing gigs or gamble on something like maybe crypto or TikTok, be it a social media influencer. And for context, just to be clear, Gen Z are those born after 1997, and they're navigating a world where stability is really rare. The gig economy, the side hustles are dominating, with many jobs offering no health care, no retirement benefits, and at the same time, there's unprecedented opportunity. So it's very, very strange. You've got digital entrepreneurship, creator wealth, and instant access to investment platforms. So there's definitely a very interesting thing going on with this Gen Z, because there's a dilemma. Well, what's the dilemma? These opportunities come with volatility. I told you, well, at the same time, he's got all these opportunities. Yes, a viral video could pay your rent, but it can't replace the predictability of a steady paycheck, pension, or affordable housing market. So let's not get that messed up. Let's understand those numbers. Zoomers, if you're out there, are you banking on digital income streams, or do you still dream of traditional stability? Comment, let us know, because this is where the future of wealth really hangs in the balance. And we want to know what you're thinking, what's out there. Yes, digital currency, that, hey, we've got to move forward. That's happening. So I'd like to hear from you. So here's the invisible wall. If we circle back to the invisible wall and we think about those stories that we just heard, boomers climbed a ladder that was firmly bolted to the ground. Millennials found the ladder greased and shaky with rungs missing. And Gen Z, well, Gen Z, they're being told to build their own ladder while balancing on a gig economy tightrope, while also understanding the digital currency that's coming in. And the truth is, none of this comes down to laziness or bad choices or kids these days. It comes down to the era you were born into and that invisible wall of time that is shaping not just your bank account, but your sense of security, your mental health, and your hope for the future. So let me ask you, when you look at your financial journey, do you think it was shaped more by your personal choices or by the era you were born into? I'd like to know, because that's the heart of this conversation. And if you are getting something out of this conversation, consider subscribing to this podcast or following wherever you listen to your podcast. I also have memberships that give you exclusive content that you can find on my YouTube channel, which I'll link in the show notes, along with a link to support me through buying me a coffee, watching, liking, subscribing, joining my membership only content, or just simply sharing this podcast, because this platform isn't just about me, it's about us. And that support helps me share my voice so that I can hear yours. And together we can bring into light what's been hidden in silence for far too long. Now, speaking of silence, let's shift perspectives and look at some shared realities, because we want to look beyond the blame game. And we've walked a little bit through the invisible wall, maybe how it was built a little bit, but let's talk about how we usually respond to it, because I think that's important. Because too often, instead of understanding each other, generations end up blaming each other. We can see a lot of that happening. Boomers are called greedy, millennials are mocked for their spending habits, Gen Z is accused of being lazy. But here's the thing, when we look beyond those stereotypes, the reality is much more complex and a lot more shared realities. So let's just debunk some of those stereotypes by looking at some real stories. Because if we look at Helen, for example, she's 72 and she's a boomer. She would fall into that generation. And she worked her whole life as a secretary, saved what she could, and now she relies on Social Security and a modest pension. But as we all know, healthcare costs are rising and inflation is eroding her fixed income. So she finds herself choosing between food and prescriptions some months. Does Helen sound like the stereotype of a boomer lounging somewhere on a yacht? Not at all. She's proof that not all boomers are wealthy, and many are just quietly struggling. But then we need to take a look at a story of a millennial, because we want to break that avocado toast myth, right? They're spending too much, their spending habits. So let's look at Michael. He's a millennial entrepreneur who started a small landscaping business in his 20s, his late 20s. He saves diligently, invests, and has built stability, not because life was easy for him, but because he fought through student debt and years of underemployment. He laughs when people tell him, hey, millennials are broke because they spend too much on lattes. For him, financial success came not from cutting, going out and cutting coffee or not buying lattes, for example, but from resilience and from hustle. Now, what about Gen Z, the lazy label they get? Let's look at Aaliyah. She is 20, juggling full time classes and running a TikTok account that pays her tuition through brand partnerships. So for her, it worked out. She works harder than most people, twice her age would even imagine, and yet she's still labeled lazy. That's a stereotype by some people. But her story dismantles that stereotype that Gen Z just spends all day scrolling without ambition. For her, ambition is survival. So you're looking at some shared struggles across generations. There is a common ground because what Helen, Michael, and Aaliyah all show us is this: while those struggles look different, they're all wrestling with the same pressures: rising cost of living, uncertainty about the future, and systems that feel stacked against them. Inflation doesn't care how old you are. Let me say that again. Inflation doesn't care how old you are. Rising rents don't ask you what generation you're from. So whether you're 25 or 75, those checkout line moments when you're gasping at the grocery prices that keep rising week to week, that's universal. Have you ever caught yourself thinking then? Because this is what I'm thinking in this moment. And have you caught yourself thinking this? Wow, everything feels more expensive than it used to be. That's not just a millennial thing or a boomer thing, that's all of us. So just drop a comment if you've ever felt that too, because I want people scrolling by to see just how widespread this reality is. Because we're looking at within generation inequality. Because here's another layer. That is another layer that we don't talk about: the inequality within each generation. Not every boomer got in on the housing boom. Many rented their whole lives. Not every millennial is drowning in debt. Some are lucky and were lucky enough to graduate debt free and stepped into high paying jobs. And not every Gen Z is gambling on crypto. Some are choosing steady traditional career paths. That's not to say crypto is not steady. If you take a look at the news, we're moving in different ways into the digital world, but that's a whole nother episode. So when we say boomers versus millennials versus Gen Z, we miss the reality that the divide inside each generation can be just as stark as the divide between them. So I'm thinking right now, do you think the bigger divide is between generations or within your own generation? After stating that, think about it. Think about it. Do you think the bigger divide is between generations or within your own generation? Let me know. Drop a comment. I guarantee you the responses might surprise you. The point is, the point is, stereotypes divide us, but the struggles connect us. When we reduce each other to characters, we miss the truth that every generation has both privilege, pain, wealth, and struggle. And if we stop pointing fingers long enough, we might realize we're all standing on the same shaky financial ground. Knowledge transfer and mentorship matters on this shaky ground because that's the blueprint, I think, for bridging that gap. So, if blaming each other isn't the answer, what is? How do we bridge this generational wealth gap instead of widening it? One of the most popular tools we have isn't a financial product. I know you were going to expect me to say that, or a policy, or even money itself. It's knowledge. It's knowledge. That's what I referenced when I said the blueprint for bridging is knowledge transfer and mentorship. When wisdom flows across generations, everybody wins. So there are conversations out there right now that are actually working. So I ran across a story recently. His name is David. He's 30 and he had finally worked up the courage to ask his grandfather how he bought his first home. Here we go with sharing knowledge across generations. His grandfather was happy he asked, and he shared details about the VA loans and low interest mortgages in the 1960s, programs David didn't even know existed back then. And that sparked a whole conversation about today's options for loans for homes, interest rates, and how different the landscape is now. For David, that conversation didn't hand him a house necessarily, but it gave him perspective and a roadmap for asking better questions. So I have a challenge for you. Ask someone from a different generation one financial question this week. It could be something as simple as, what was your first job like? Or how did you save money when you were younger? Then come back and share it with the community. Tell us what you've learned. And you might be surprised at what you learned and how much wisdom and perspective is sitting right across the table or across the room. I can talk about this in the sense that when we talk about David's story, we're talking about mentorship in action. And again, there's all kinds of stories out there. Take Sarah's story. She's 28, and I ran across her story when I was researching this topic. And she shared the story of how an older colleague taught her the power of compound interest. So, what he did is he sat her down, showed her how he invested in his 401k consistently, and even pulled out his old pay stubs to prove it. She started contributing right away in her own way. Remember, everything is different on the financial plane, but you are still learning knowledge. Anyway, she started investing, and within a few years, she was already building a cushion she never thought was possible. For her, mentorship wasn't abstract, it was life changing advice that came from a, a different generation because they had lived it before her. Which is, if you go back to the video I did talking about the job market and ageism, and if you're over 40, really late 30s, how difficult it is to find a job and how important I think it is for generations to work together. This is an example as to why. Now, let's talk about mentorship because we need to look at the flip side because mentorship isn't just one way. So I don't want you to think that it's just one way because that would not be telling the whole truth. There was a story I ran across researching this, and this point reminds me of this story. I think his name was Chris. He was in his 20s. He helped his parents set up online banking and showed them how to use an investment app to track stocks. In return, his father shared his experience navigating the real estate market in, I think it was the 1980s, and both walked away with new tools. So it's like a reverse mentorship, a flip side to it. You know, Chris had walked away with real estate know-how, and his parents now have digital confidence. So, has anyone ever given you financial advice that completely changed your perspective? Or maybe you taught a parent or grandparent something about apps, crypto, or online investing. Share your story. We'd love to hear reverse mentorship in action. The truth is, knowledge transfer is wealth transfer. And this is why mentorship matters. Money might not always move easily between generations, but wisdom can. And in today's economy, wisdom is often the difference between treading water and getting ahead. Imagine if every boomer then who built equity in the housing market mentored a millennial drowning in rent. Imagine if every Zoomer fluent in digital finance apps mentored a retiree trying to manage investments online. These would not be considered small gestures. These would be bridges that carry us all forward. And at the end of the day, bridging the gap doesn't mean waiting for politicians or financial institutions to fix the system. You know how I don't like to talk about things without trying to give a little bit of help, or maybe, hopefully, some type of solution. But in this case, I think it's about bridging the gap. And so if we stop waiting for policies to do that, it can start in our families, our workplaces, our communities. One conversation, one piece of advice, one shared lesson at a time. Because then now we're passing wisdom between generations. Wealth in all its forms follows close behind. So, if we've talked about knowledge transfer, we've talked about the wisdom, the advice that can bridge generations, we do need to talk about resources because what about those? Because sometimes the most powerful way to fight the wealth gap isn't just sharing stories like I just did, it's sharing space, time, and even money. So, across the country, families are finding very creative ways to pool resources. And in the process, they are rewriting the financial playbook, really, because the truth is, everybody's everybody sees the high cost of everything happening, and families are thinking, they're putting their thinking caps on. If I ran across this story, and this was a family out there, three generations, grandparents, parents, and two adult children. And by the way, I kept running across the same story, different family name. They all chipped in to do what, you ask? To buy a duplex. So the grandparents live on one side, the younger family on the other. Not only do they split the mortgage and utility costs, but the adult children are also building equity far earlier than they could have on their own right now in this economy. So, really, what started out as a practical solution turned into a generational investment strategy that will ultimately end up in generational wealth. So, would you ever live in a multi generational home if it meant financial freedom? Drop a simple yes or no in the comments. I want to see where people stand on this because this is a very interesting approach. And I have another example for you about how we can innovative sharing, we can cut costs, we can make it through. Because I ran across some very interesting stories from families where you had some millennials. It was specifically, I was running into this with millennials. They were struggling with the high cost of childcare. And instead of paying thousands a month for daycare, they decided, a lot of different families decided to move closer to wherever their retired parents live. And now those parents can help watch their toddler during the day. In exchange, the kids, the older kids, obviously, they help their parents manage medical appointments, transportation, going to the grocery store. And so by sharing responsibilities, they've saved thousands of dollars also while strengthening family bonds. Obviously, this will not work for every family, especially if you have a very dysfunctional family. But if you don't, and it can work. This kind of resource sharing isn't just about saving money, it's freeing up capital. When childcare or elder care costs are reduced, that money can go toward paying down debt, investing, which is important, or even building emergency savings. It's a ripple effect that benefits everyone in the household. So, have you ever shared resources across generations like this? Whether that's childcare, elder care, housing, or even something simple like splitting cars? Let us know. I'd like to see if there's a lot of other generations maybe out there doing this. And don't forget, resources aren't always financial. I think that's what we're kind of hearing right now. Sometimes also they can be technological. I ran across in the Gen Z generation, there was an individual, he was a coder, and he guess what he did? He taught his grandmother how to manage her retirement funds online and set up fraud alerts. Also, he taught her a little bit about coding, and in exchange, she actually gave him $5,000 from her savings to help him launch his freelance business. Now, listen, both of them walked away empowered, though. She gained digital independence, knows a little bit about coding, and he got a head start as an entrepreneur. That's the power of resource reallocation. It's not charity because they're both getting something. It's collaboration. Each generation is bringing something to the table, and when we stop hoarding resources and start sharing them, everyone gets stronger. Now, we often think about money as a zero sum game. So if one generation wins, another must lose. There's a lot of people that think about that. But resource allocation flips that script because we're pooling resources, whether it's housing, childcare, or even knowledge of technology. We don't just survive the system then, we outsmart it together through generations. Now, let's go back and think about that invisible wall that we walked through and looked at the stereotypes and looked at mentorships and looked at resource sharing. I think for me, now the question becomes, what do we do with all this? This is great information, but what do we do with all this? Because talking about the generational wealth gap, it's important. It certainly is. In this way, it definitely is busting through those stereotypes specifically. But what really matters is how we build something better. And let me tell you about one family that I met. For privacy purposes, I'll just call them the Thompsons. Three generations under one roof: grandparents, parents, and teenage kids. On paper, they shouldn't have been able to get ahead because the grandparents live on a fixed income. The parents were paying off student loans, and the teens were just starting part time jobs. But guess what they did? Instead of operating separately, they pooled their resources. The grandparents helped with childcare, the teens helped with digital tools and side hustles, and the parents took charge of budgeting and investments. Within 5 years, they paid down their debt and even bought a rental property together. Now, I say that's not just survival, that's collaboration. And it shows that when generations stop blaming each other and start building together, the outcome isn't just stability, it's prosperity. So here's my challenge to you. I got another one for you. This week, see if you can have one money conversation with someone outside your generation. Just one. It could be asking your parent how they save for retirement, or you could be asking your child what apps they use to invest, or it could be asking your grandparent what their first paycheck was like. It doesn't have to be heavy, it doesn't have to be long, but just one question that opens up the door. And every door we open is going to build another bridge. So imagine a future then. Imagine a future where boomers share their hard won lessons about housing and retirement, where millennials pass on strategies for resilience in tough job markets, where Gen Z teaches digital fluency to older generations, each group carrying a piece of the puzzle, each piece fitting together into a bigger picture of financial security. That does not have to be a fantasy. It is possible, but it only happens if we're willing to step off our silos and into each other's lives. And at the end of the day, the generational wealth gap, the disparity, isn't about winners and losers. It's about bridges and walls. We can keep stacking those bricks of blame, or we can start laying stones of understanding. And the truth is, the future we want isn't handed to us, it's built together, brick by brick, across generations. And if you've made it this far, thank you. Seriously, I know your time is valuable and thank you for spending it with me. And do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, share this with someone from another generation, and let's keep this conversation alive because this isn't just about money. It's about building a future where every generation has the chance to thrive. And this, it really starts with us right here, right now. Until the next episode, take care of your mind, body, and soul.